Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. Hopefully everyone had a Merry Christmas out there. It's been a while since we've done a forecast discussion video here on the channel, but we have severe weather that is back in the forecast across parts of the southern U.S. Starting today for the next few days, we're going to focus on today's threat in this video, but we will look ahead to our next real elevated severe risk that is expected to take place on Saturday, December 28th. But for today, the SPC has outlined a slight risk, level 2 out of 5, in the yellow shaded region you see here. So that is going to include places like Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, Austin, Houston, Galveston, Beaumont, up toward Lufkin, Nacogdoches, over toward Shreveport, Tyler, Texas, Longview, over toward Alexandria, Louisiana as well, down toward Lake Charles. You are all under the gun for a level 2 out of 5 severe weather risk for today. Level 1 out of 5 a marginal risk does extend around that slight risk in the dark green you see here. So places like Wichita Falls over toward Little Rock and places like, say, New Iberia, Louisiana, you are in that level 1 out of 5 marginal risk for today. But the greatest threat is going to be in the yellow shaded regions here. The I-35 corridor, Dallas toward Waco and Austin, your severe threat is going to be somewhat limited in time scale today, as that is going to be the corridor within which storms are going to most likely initiate within this setup. At least one portion of the convection should initiate here along the I-35 corridor, and then storms will quickly move off to the east, effectively ending the severe threat for you today. So not going to be too much of a severe threat. The core of the risk is going to be off toward the east and southeast of your areas, but you still should keep an eye out for some isolated large hail, isolated damaging winds, and maybe a brief tornado or two. But that risk is going to maximize out here as we go farther into the slight risk across parts of East Texas, places like Houston, Galveston, Beaumont, toward Lufkin, and over into western Louisiana. All hazards are on the table for today. We do have a tornado risk. It is at a 5% right now in the brown shading you see there. So again, that tornado risk is going to be low for parts of the I-35 corridor, but moving off to the east as those storms move into a little bit better environment and mature a little bit, they will be able to have a greater chance of producing some tornadoes for today. 2% extends outside of that as well. Damaging wind also going to be a risk there, mostly in the yellow shaded region, so that's a little bit off to the east of where storms are going to initiate. Storms are expected to congeal into more of a line. We'll talk about that here in just a bit, producing more of a damaging wind risk with this setup, and isolated large hail, especially in the early portion of the convective life cycle, and with any more discrete convection we see going off into the afternoon and evening hours today. So that is today. The threat will continue into tomorrow. Marginal risk level 1 out of 5 into parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama for tomorrow, but it is expected to be a low-end threat for tomorrow. And then we see a ramp up in severe probabilities once again across, a little bit shifted off to the east compared to today's threat, but we do have a slight risk out for day 3, which again is going to be Saturday, December 28th. Far east Texas, much of Louisiana, southern Arkansas, into the core of Mississippi there. So places like Shreveport, Alexandria, Greenville, Mississippi, over toward Jackson, the I-55 corridor there. You are in a slight risk for now as part of the Saturday threat, large marginal risk extending outside of that. Again, going to focus on today's threat in this video, but toward the end of the video, we will look ahead toward the Thursday threat as well to give you a little bit of an idea of what to expect for that risk for Saturday. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Let's take a look at what's going on right now across the U.S. This is our visible satellite imagery. And what you see across parts of Texas is perhaps something that is going to keep the severe risk from really getting out of hand today. And that is all of this cloud cover. You can see very thick, low-level cloud cover across much of the eastern, really 2/3 of Texas here today. And that has been pretty persistent this morning and should be somewhat persistent through the afternoon as we see this strong warm advection regime make its way onshore across East Texas. If we play the loop here, you'll see all of these clouds, these low-level clouds moving from north to south. That is on our low-level southerly flow, bringing that warm, moist air mass back into the region from the Gulf of Mexico. We'll talk about why we're not going to see, we won't be seeing a more widespread threat, a more northward advance of the greatest area for severe weather today in just a bit. But we do have that warm advection regime. This is all sort of north of the warm front you see here over the Gulf of Mexico. Not much cloud cover going on really at all compared to areas farther north. That is where our warm front is situated, still very far south here. All of this activity you see here, all these bubbling cloud tops, that is thunderstorm activity this morning, but that is well elevated to the well to the north of the warm frontal zone, not be able to tap into robust surface-based instability at this point. And that could be, again, a hampering factor for today's severe threat is all of this cloud cover. We're going to have to monitor and see how it breaks up and how it burns off going into the afternoon. If we see quite a bit of clearing here moving in from the south, or we get some breaks in here from moving in from the west, then we may see a little bit greater of a severe risk pop up. If this cloud cover continues to hang around for much of the afternoon, the morning into the early afternoon hours, we won't be able to destabilize the atmosphere as much. That severe threat will be a little bit held a little bit more at bay. Here is our current radar, recording this just after 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, and we do see quite a bit of convective activity ongoing already at this point. Again, all of this is elevated well to the north of the warm frontal zone, so the severe threat is going to be very minimal with this activity. Could see some rumbles of thunder within this activity, some heavier rainfall, but anything as far as tornadic activity, that is going to hold off until later on in the day. But this is your main area of convection right now, moving into North Texas. Texas going to be impacting the DFW Metroplex likely by the time you see this video. I-35 corridor here, that is going to be where these storms are moving into at the moment. Again, not much of a severe threat with this activity. Some stuff off to the east as well along the I-20 corridor there, Tyler, Longview, up into the Arklatex region here within the next hour or two. But again, this is elevated activity. We do see some storms down here across southeast Texas moving in from the Gulf of Mexico. These storms are going to have the first opportunity to be really robust severe weather makers for today. Again, I still expect that most of the activity this morning is going to remain somewhat behaved, if you will. But we could see an isolated supercell or two develop out of this activity, perhaps producing a brief tornado, brief damaging wind gust, maybe some isolated large hail this morning. But again, the main threat is going to be this afternoon if we can get that destabilization to really occur. And that is when convective coverage and intensity is expected to increase. So keep a very close eye on these storms this morning, but again, not expecting much, especially down here in southeast Texas. Keep an eye on those storms, but not expecting much as far as a robust severe threat with this morning activity. Again, these storms over by DFW, not going to be much of a severe weather maker at this point. Let's take a look at some of our upper air data right now. This is our 500 millibar map. And we can zoom in on our southern plains here, and you see this trough, this very compact but potent trough here across the southern U.S., moving quickly off to the east. Strong jet streak rounding the backside of this trough. This is a very compact but potent trough, 60 to 70 knots of flow there within that jet streak here. And that is going to move off to the east today. We already are starting to see some of the exit region of this trough impinging upon the eastern half of Texas. That's why we're already starting to see convective development here across this region, even though it is somewhat elevated. That will continue going into the late morning and early afternoon hours. We'll probably see convective coverage and intensity increase as we go into the lunchtime hour today and into the early afternoon hours especially. We'll see that radar start to light up a little bit more with more intense convective activity. We go up to 300 millibars in this exit region of this trough. It is a little bit displaced off to the north here at the 300 millibar level, but we do see a little bit of defluence aloft here making its way into this region of Texas here. You see a little bit more, slightly more westerly component down here across East Texas, so that is providing a little bit of defluence that's spreading apart of the wind vectors in the upper levels of the atmosphere, helping to induce rising motion to fill that void aloft. So we see a little bit of that here at 300 millibars. We'd see perhaps a little bit more there at 500 millibars. You can see those winds spreading apart a little bit in the exit region of this trough. So that is all to say that we have plenty of forcing for severe weather today. And that is going to mean quite a few storms, quite a high convective coverage today. And that is due in part to some of our thermodynamics. We're going to take a look at that here in just a second. But given this focused forcing here in the exit region of this trough, small, compact trough, we're probably going to see a lot of convection develop here. Now, that is going to keep the storm mode a little bit on the messier side today. And as we know, messier storm modes, more linear, clustered modes, not as favorable for significant tornadic activity. Still favorable for tornadoes, but not so much those long track significant tornadoes that we often see in more discrete supercell events. So that is one factor that is going to keep the threat at bay today, is the storm mode. We'll take a look at that a little bit more deeply here in just a second. Down to the surface, interestingly, we have not had a robust low-level response with this trough. It is a little bit farther south than is usual, but we just have not seen a very significant low-level response with this setup, which is quite interesting. This trough has been able to traverse the higher terrain down here of the southern high plains. So you would expect to see some sort of strong surface low development out here. The jet streak, as we talked about, still on the backside of this trough. As we discussed here just a minute ago, there's your jet streak, still well relegated, the strongest winds relegated to the backside of the trough. So that is likely perhaps the culprit here. Not quite a strong flow developing on the east side of the trough, perhaps not quite as strong of a low-level response here. But we still have seen some semblance of surface low development out here across central Texas. You see that closed ISO bar there. That is the center of a very weak, broad surface low, and that is another thing. Another red flag for me for this severe weather setup, as far as something that might decrease the overall severe threat, is we have somewhat of a nebulous, ill-defined surface pattern. Just from an anecdotal evidence, a lot of these setups I've seen that don't quite have that real tight surface low, well-defined surface boundaries, those events do not tend to be quite as organized with the convection. Not from a organized convection in terms of supercells and squall lines, but just you have a lot of messy convection over a broad area, not really organized into distinct convective areas. It just means a lot of convection out here all the way across near your surface boundaries in the open warm sector. Just leads to an overall messy event I've seen in most of these cases. So if we had a much tighter surface low here, I'd be a lot more concerned, much more defined boundaries, but we just don't have that at this point. And that, I think, is going to be a saving grace as well for this setup today, is going to be a little bit of a lack of overall organization to the convection, leading to just sporadic, more clustered, just a lot of convection over a broad area instead of more discrete, isolated convection here with today's setup. But we do have those winds that have started to back out of the southeast, bringing that warm, moist air mass up into the Texas area from the Gulf of Mexico. Let's go ahead and take a look at our raw surface data. One note here before we go into the actual numbers, you'll see all these pink circles, full pink circles here at these stations. That indicates cloud cover, heavy low-level cloud cover. You see that is very expansive across this region. So again, we're going to have to watch that closely. If we don't see a lot of clearing here in this portion of the risk area, really across the entire risk area, then we are not going to see a more robust severe threat develop. But if we do see some clearing, we will see a more robust threat develop here today. But for now, you can see mostly across Texas, it is cool and somewhat dry. Dew points in the 50s, temperatures in the 50s and low 60s as well. Very saturated low levels here. You see the temperatures and the dew points here. A lot of these stations are the same. 60 over 60 here, 60 over 60. There at Lufkin, Jasper, 61 over 61. That is indicative of a very moist low-level air mass, very cool and moist low-level air mass. Perhaps some fog here ongoing across these areas. Again, this is well north of the warm front at this point. We can kind of pinpoint where our features are, but again, it is a little bit chaotic at the surface because our surface pattern not all that well defined. But you see some counterclockwise flow around what appears to be the surface low center here. Surface low center looks to be perhaps somewhere in the San Angelo to Abilene area. Again, somewhat of an elongated, ill-defined surface low here, but that looks to be where our surface low center is setting up, somewhere in this vicinity here near the Abilene to San Angelo area. Cold front appears to be draped down to the south. It is somewhat, again, of an ill-defined boundary, but we do see a wind shift here across West Texas, winds out of the due west, more southwesterly winds here just ahead of the cold front. So that does appear to be your cold frontal boundary right there. Warm front, a little bit difficult to pinpoint here, does not really look all that defined, to be honest here. I'm not really seeing a bona fide wind shift. Or a strong thermal gradient here. Your best thermal gradient does appear to be down here across southeast Texas. We see a very nice thermal gradient there of your 60s and 70s dew points. They're still relegated well down here to the southeast Texas coast. And that is one reason, again, why we're not going to see a more expansive severe risk up here in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas. That is because we have had our preceding wave move through over the last couple days. We had that severe threat on Tuesday, that slight risk across East Texas. Well, that was from a preceding trough that moved through on Tuesday. And I'll go back here and show you. If we go back to the 24th, and let's say the afternoon of the 24th, and I will go up to 500 millibars here. This was our first trough. This was our lead wave that made its way off to the east. Not much of a severe weather maker. Didn't have much time to really modify that air mass out ahead of it. But because we had this trough move through, we had an associated low-level response that kind of swept out the dew points, the best moisture out into the Gulf. If we did not have this preceding wave, we would see our main wave here back to the west move through, and we'd have several days to allow that moisture to get really far off to the north, and we'd have a much more northward expansive severe risk. But because we had that early trough, that preceding wave, sweep all that moisture out into the Gulf, and we haven't had much time to really bring that moisture back into the region. And that's why still, on the morning of our severe event, we're still seeing our best moisture relegated down here to the southeast Texas coast. Most of our threat area right now, again, cool and dry conditions, 50s and low 60s temperatures with dew points in the upper 50s to low 60s here. So we need to see that warm front move off to the north pretty quickly over the next couple of hours. We're going to see mostly just-in-time moisture. Not a huge fan of just-in-time moisture setups from a severe weather perspective, as they just seem to have some issues with them. You don't have a ton of time to really modify that air mass to get a really destabilized air mass for significant severe weather. So lots of red flags here with this setup for me. Some things that I look for that dissuade me from chasing certain events. I'm seeing a lot of those with this particular setup, and that is a good thing for the residents of East Texas, western Louisiana, southern Arkansas. That is going to keep the severe threat, I think, somewhat at bay for today on this day after Christmas. So that surface low going to move off to the northeast and east today. Not going to tighten up significantly at any point in this setup today, which again is going to keep that surface pattern somewhat ill-defined. We will see a northward advance of this more moist air mass here. How far north that gets, that leading edge of the moisture, is going to define the northern extent of the most robust severe risk. SPC does think that it's going to be probably somewhere here in the Arklatex region by this afternoon. We'll have to wait and see how that does occur. Again, all that cloud cover could keep that warm front a little bit farther south than expected, so we'll have to watch that for sure. So that's what's going on at the surface. Let's take a look at some soundings here. This is at Dallas-Fort Worth this morning. Again, all these soundings still well north of the warm front. And so we are going to see very cool and dry surface temperatures here. This is at 6 a.m. Central Standard Time, 55 over 52 there at the surface. So very cool, very dry surface characteristics here at this point. But we can take a look above that to see some of our thermodynamic characteristics. We do see a little bit of an elevated mix layer. That has been a concern with this setup, is the degree of an elevated mix layer. Forecast models had not really shown a stout elevated mix layer with this setup. And that does tend to allow for more rapid convective initiation over a broader area. So just lots of storms going up all at the same time leads to a very messy storm mode. Not this EML here, not really a classic elevated mix layer here. The lapse rates in this layer not all that steep, not all that uniform. But we do see some steeper lapse rates here in this layer. We do see a stout capping inversion here. Actually, it's not all that stout. Would be pretty easy to erode with this strong forcing from the trough coming in, probably already starting to erode pretty quickly here across this region. Let's go back here to our SPC mesoanalysis page and see if we can see the cap erosion across this region. I'll zoom in here to our southern sector and take a look at our mixed layer cape, and you are already starting to see that erode here out across the southeast Texas vicinity. Very weak cap holding to the north of the warm front. So once that warm front moves off to the north and we start to see destabilization move in from the south, we're going to see a pretty rapid erosion of the cap and probably pretty rapid thunderstorm development here. So it's not going to take much to get thunderstorms to go in this environment, given all the forcing we have here. You can already see all this convection to the north of the front. Anywhere where that area where we see destabilization, going to be pretty easy to get thunderstorms to go here with all that forcing, going to really erode that cap very efficiently. And it's really not all that stout of a capping inversion here across the DFW Metroplex this morning. Here at Lake Charles, even worse, not much of a cap at all. So really not a robust elevated mixed layer here across this region. Not a robust capping here at all across these areas. So once the forcing really does move in and once the destabilization occurs, it's going to be very, very rapid storm development, which is why we're expecting a little bit earlier initiation with this setup today, probably midday to early afternoon. depending on where the warm front is located, and where the warm sector is located at that time. That is where we'll see our first development, and fairly early because of this somewhat of a lack of elevated mixed layer and this forcing that is moving in from the trough. Here's Corpus Christi. We do see a little bit more of an elevated mixed layer here out across this area. 66 over 65 at the surface. I tend to think this little spike in the dew point there, or a decrease in the dew point, very rapid there, is somewhat of a sounding artifact there. Not expecting much. Not expecting that to be somewhat of what we'll see in reality. We do see an elevated mixed layer here at Corpus Christi. This layer right in here, where lapse rates are approaching 8.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That is a pretty stout elevated mixed layer. I don't think, again, it's all that stout. This may be a little bit of an overestimation here. Again, that is where our moist air mass is right now. So 66 over 65, probably already starting to erode that. Yeah, we're seeing temperatures already in the 70s here at Corpus Christi, 71 over 69 already at this point. So that is going to lead to a quick erosion of the cap, or probably already sufficient erosion of the cap to almost get ready for convective initiation down there and just off to the northeast as that forcing moves in from the trough. But elevated instability here, steep lapse rates aloft, leading to some isolated large hail. Our wind profiles, not all that impressive at this point. Not a ton of turning here at this point, but we will see that increase as the low-level flow does increase somewhat through the day, especially our low-level jet at about 850 millibars expected to increase, helping to really curve those photographs making them favorable for tornadic activity. All right, let's take a look at some model data here. This is our 12Z NAM, hot off the press this morning. Starting out at 500 millibars, here is our trough. Again, most of the stronger flow relegated to the backside of the trough. That trough will meander off to the east today. That flow will start to round the base of the trough into the exit region here by 18Z. You can see this is our axis of the trough, and we're already well within that exit region there across parts of much of East Texas. And so that's equates to very strong forcing, very focused forcing. Lots of storms going to develop fairly early in this event. This is at 1 p.m., or this is at actually midday out here across Texas. So we should see convective coverage increase fairly rapidly, perhaps even by late morning into the lunchtime hour today across the risk area. So that moves off to the east pretty quickly, and we go into tomorrow morning. That trough moves off to the east. We'll see an extension of the threat going into the the Gulf Coast states there into tomorrow morning. Down at the surface, let's see how the surface pattern progresses through the afternoon today. So once again, a fairly nebulous, ill-defined surface pattern here. Not really a tight surface flow, not really your well-defined boundaries here through the day. We do see some semblance of perhaps a little bit of strengthening of the surface flow, a little bit of a deepening of the surface flow there across East Texas going into the afternoon. Interestingly, the NAM here appears to hold that warm front pretty far to the south, which is interesting. This is going to be at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time today, and that surface low appears to be all the way out in here, fairly far to the south, which is somewhat of a change from the previous models. We'll show you here in just a second with our moisture fields, but that is somewhat of a change from our previous model runs, and that could be just all of that cloud cover sticking around, not really able to erode. This morning convective activity holding that warm front, reinforcing it down here to the south across portions of more southeast Texas into south central Louisiana. So that is an interesting development here from the NAM compared to what some of the other models had shown the previous couple of days. But your surface low here out across East Texas, somewhat in there, looks to be just to the southwest of the Shreveport area, at least on this NAM run by 0Z, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So that will be, again, demarcate the northern extent of the surface-based severe threat here to the south of these boundaries. So this would lead to a more confined severe threat here today. And that is a situation, again, if this cloud cover sticks around and these storms reinforce that boundary off to the south a little bit more. And then we see the surface low move off to the east, deepen a little bit going into the morning hours tomorrow. And again, that will allow that threat to persist across Louisiana and Mississippi going into the morning hours tomorrow. Let's take a look at our moisture here. So this is our dew point field. Not something you'd want to see as if you're a storm chaser here out across your target area of interest on at the morning of a severe weather day. Your best moisture confined well to the south here across southeast and southern Texas. And again, that has held on for quite some time here. We do see some rapid northward advance of the moisture here, but again, this is at 21Z. Your surface low somewhere out in here, somewhat ill-defined, but your warm front appears to be right in here. Far east Texas, maybe the Lufkin area, southward, Lufkin over to Lake Charles, just north of Lake Charles and southward. And your cold frontal zone out in here across maybe the I-35 corridor. This is at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. So that would confine where your severe threat is going to be. Severe threat would be southeast of the cold front, south of the warm front, leading to a spatially more confined severe risk than what the SPC has shown in their outlooks this morning. So interesting development here from the NAM. I want to go back a couple of runs here and show you what the models have been showing. This is yesterday morning's run. You see a little bit farther north of a warm front here with this run, and maybe even we'll go back a little bit more here, perhaps one more day. You see perhaps even slightly farther north here with the NAM. We'll take a look at the GFS as well. The GFS has had a pretty aggressive moisture return here for the last couple of days, and you see those 60s dew points make their way all the way into southern Arkansas there compared to the NAM, which was much, much farther to the south. This was a couple of days ago. This was yesterday morning. Came on board a little bit with a more southward position of the warm front, but still farther north than what the NAM is showing today. And the GFS not quite out yet. This is at 18Z today. We compare this to the NAM, and you see it's a little bit more on board with what the NAM is showing. Even the NAM, though, the NAM is way far south with the warm front. So that probably is a little bit of an outlier, perhaps something right in the middle of this. You see these red contours, that's your lifted index where your unstable areas. I probably would think that's going to be somewhere in here, I would suspect, perhaps splitting the difference between these two model runs. So the NAM may be a little bit extreme as far as the positioning of the warm front, maybe a little bit too far south, but still, this is a change from the last few days when we had a little bit farther north of a warm sector up here into more of the Arklatex region, northern Louisiana. Not seeing that as much more confined warm sector here down into more of East Texas, into central and southern Louisiana. Anything north of that, storms will be elevated here across the Arklatex, so that means places like the I-20 corridor it may be more of a situation of elevated storms with more of a large hail risk. But if the warm front, that will be something to watch. If the warm front does lift farther north than what is expected, then we could see that tornado risk extend up there as well. Would not be shocked to see the SPC perhaps trim this risk a little bit farther to the south just based on trends right now, but we'll have to see. And for now, anyone in this yellow shaded region needs to be on alert for that greatest risk of severe weather. But the model's certainly not in the data, not showing that we might not see it as far of a northward advance of that warm sector as expected. That shifts off to the east going into Friday morning. Confined warm sector there across Louisiana and Mississippi for a continued severe threat there. Mostly going to be a squall line with damaging wind threat and perhaps a brief tornado or two. Let's take a look at some of the soundings here. Let's take one here just to the west of the Houston area, 18Z. Then we'll move on to 21Z here between Houston and College Station maybe. And then we'll go into 0Z, maybe just to the east of the Houston area. So this is going to be our 18Z sounding at Houston, and that is a very favorable look for all severe hazards there. Plenty of instability, about almost 2,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. So we are seeing some destabilization, better destabilization to the south here with this setup. A nice looking thermodynamic profile there, some fatter CAPE there in the mid-levels. So that is going to be a favorable look for robust updrafts there. Couple that with this wind profile, very favorable wind profile for tornadic activity. Nice curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, nice streamwise vorticity there in the low levels as well. That's when your storm relative wind vector there in pink is parallel to your horizontal vorticity vector in green. And that does appear to be the case there through the low levels of the atmosphere, favorable for tornadogenesis in supercells there. Upwards of 330 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative velocity, strong deep layer shear to support supercells as well. So all in all, this is a very favorable look for severe storms with all hazards, including a tornado threat there. So the main factor here is going to be storm mode. If storms are pretty quickly forming into more of a line, then we're going to see mostly a damaging wind and embedded tornado risk. If we can hang on to a semblance of discrete activity or semi-discrete activity here going into the afternoon, then we will see more. Then we could see more of a robust tornado threat develop, and not off the table, not out of the question, is a strong tornado. If we get a more robust discrete supercell to sustain itself, a strong tornado or two not completely out of the question. There is not, again, a strong tornado risk outlined yet by the SPC, but they have mentioned it in the past couple outlooks, and certainly this profile would be favorable for perhaps a strong tornado or two here. And again, this is as early as midday 18Z, which is noon Central Standard Time there. So all in all, favorable look for severe weather. One perhaps negative factor here, again, is the low levels there. Very saturated low levels, somewhat weak lapse rates there in the lowest couple kilometers of the atmosphere. Sub 6 degrees Celsius per kilometer lapse rates there in the 0 to 3 kilometer layer may temper the robustness of the updrafts there, especially the low-level updrafts. But overall, plenty of instability on the deep layer and plenty of deep layer and low-level shear to support an all-hazards risk with supercells there in the southeast Texas area as early as midday or so. This is at 21Z. Interesting look there with the wind profiles here. Plenty of instability. We do see a little bit of an improvement there in the low levels, perhaps, but plenty of instability. Wind profile is a little bit wonky there at 21Z. Let me try to take a little bit of a different sounding here. The NAM is so compacted with the warm sector here. Let's take a look at the GFS real quick. GFS is probably a little bit better of a depiction here. This is at 21Z. Your surface low probably right in here. Your warm front somewhere in here. A little bit more expansive of a warm sector on the GFS. I tend to think the NAM might be a little bit too restricted with the size of the warm sector here. So let's take a look at the GFS just north of the Houston area at 21Z here. So this is the NAM. I think this is too much instability as well. So I think the NAM solution may be a little bit out to lunch here, a little bit too much instability. Don't expect we're going to see this much instability with all that cloud cover in play, the weak low-level lapse rates. I think this might be a little bit of an overestimate here. So taking the NAM with a grain of salt in this particular setup here, this is the GFS. GFS doesn't look all that favorable as well. Wind profiles are wonky. So models kind of all over the place here with this setup here. Overall, we do have some turning in the low levels there, strong low-level shear, some curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph with adequate instability, favorable for that all-hazard threat to continue into the afternoon. This is the NAM at 0Z. That low-level jet does ramp up pretty significantly into the nighttime hours here. 1 kilometer winds in excess of 50 knots there with very strong low-level shear, some curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, upwards of 500 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative felicity. By this time, I think the convection will be mostly organized in more clustered line segment type features. But if there are any discrete supercells hanging on here by early evening, this is at 6 p.m., then we could see that tornado risk maximize with those more discrete supercells. But that's a big if in this setup. And again, outside chance of a strong tornado with any more robust discrete convection. So all in all, just kind of a weird setup here. The model's not handling this all that well this morning. The NAM definitely the most south with the warm sector. So that is going to be an interesting thing to monitor. Let's talk about storm mode real quick. This is your cold front going to be your initiating boundary here, and any confluence bands in the warm sector going to be something to watch. Any little confluence bands in the warm sector, more subtle forcing, could lead to slightly more discrete convection there in the open warm sector, something to watch for sure. Although I still think, given the lack of an elevated mixed layer and a strong forcing, any confluence bands will favor convective development, but it might still be messy, even though those confluence bands tend to be a little bit more on the subtle side as far as forcing goes. But here is your initiating boundary. Your shear vectors definitely a little bit more parallel to the north, near and north of that warm front. They're a little bit more parallel to the cold front. So a little bit more messy mode here likely up here to the north, the northern portions of the slight risks. So that I-35 corridor, Dallas to Waco, areas off toward I-20 as well. Perhaps more of a messy, more linear, clustered storm mode. Down here to the south, we do have your shear vectors a little bit more perpendicular to the initiating boundary. So that could lead to at least a short window for semi-discrete supercells. But again, I think the overall strong forcing and lack of an elevated mixed layer will still lead to a lot of convective development along the cold front, and so that should keep the overall severe risk at bay, leaning toward more of a damaging wind and isolated embedded tornado risk with this setup. But Any discrete supercells, especially those that can fire out here in the open warm sector on confluence bands, will be a little bit more discrete, perhaps, at least initially, perhaps maximizing that tornado risk as we go into the afternoon hours today. All right, let's take a look at some convection-allowing models here. This is the 12Z HRRR. So just an estimate of what the radar might look like later on in the afternoon. And you see here by 17Z, we see an increase in convective activity, lots of robust cores here out in the open warm sector. The HRRR, I will say, has been by far the most aggressive with destabilization out here in East Texas for the last several runs. And so I've treated it as an outlier to this point. I would like to see just here, let's take a quick sounding here. This is at 17Z out in the open warm sector. And so it is kind of toned it down a little bit. Let's go into the afternoon here just to see. It's tough to get a picture with all of the convection around. So the herd perhaps has backed off a little bit with instability, but let's go ahead and take a look at the overall radar picture here, reflectivity picture. So you see a lot out here in the confluence band regime out in the open warm sector, lots of robust updrafts here. These would be supercellular given strong deep layer shear. This is at noon Central Standard Time. With the, it's tough to say, again, we don't know how the destabilization is going to play out going into the afternoon, but if we see more robust destabilization, these would certainly have that all hazards threat, including a threat for tornadoes here by lunchtime to early afternoon within this prefrontal confluence band. But you see a lot of convection. A lot of convection develops here, very messy mode, especially off to the north where that forcing is strongest and the shear vector is more parallel to the cold front. A lot more messy convection up here. But we do see some more robust cores out here in southeast Texas. I think if any significant tornado risk is going to present itself, it will be with this prefrontal activity where the destabilization is strongest out here in southeast Texas, including Houston, over to Beaumont, Orange, Lake Charles, and areas just north, maybe up toward Lufkin. That's where I think the greatest severe risk, if they are to upgrade the risk, it probably would be somewhere in that corridor there, where your most robust destabilization is. So we do see some more robust supercells in the piney woods there of East Texas, moving toward the Louisiana border this afternoon and early evening, before things really congeal into a line as they move into Louisiana, going into the nighttime hours tonight. Let's take a look at another model here. This is the WRF ARW model, just another convection-allowing model we like to use. So we see that convection increasing in coverage here this morning. We see that confluence band, just like the HRRR showed, perhaps not quite as robust here with the ARW. We do see perhaps some supercells within that line, but overall just a very messy storm mode. This is at 4 p.m. today, Central Time. Very messy, clustered mode, lots of line segments, clusters in there. Not really a discrete supercell mode. I think that's what we're going to lean toward today, with just all those factors pointing to a lot of storms developing over a broad area, but still strong low-level and deep layer shear to support some embedded tornadoes within that line, some damaging winds. And then the line moves off to the east into Louisiana, Mississippi, into the overnight hours tonight, into tomorrow morning. An SSL WRF model. Take a look at that. Again, much of the same, but very, very messy storm mode going into the afternoon today across these areas. Not a ton, if you'll notice, not a ton of robust helicity streaks in here. That, again, maybe due to the somewhat of a lack of robustness in the updrafts with those weak low-level lapse rates, perhaps, and the overall clustered mode. Where we see the strongest helicity streaks is down here, where your destabilization is strongest, southeast Texas into southwest Louisiana. So that area for sure we'll be watching most closely today. Again, Houston, Galveston, Beaumont, up toward Orange, up to Lufkin, Jasper, out in that vicinity, Lake Charles to the north there in western Louisiana. I have my eye on that area most closely with today's setup, and then things will kind of line out going into the nighttime hours tonight. So that will do it for today's threat. Let's briefly take a look at Thursday's threat. I'll go back out here to our NAM, go back to our zoomed out sector. So we'll go forward here. Going into Friday, that trough moves out. You see some stronger flow moving right back in on its heels across the western U.S. going through the day on Friday. And then we see on Saturday, we see a nice little compact, potent trough making its way out, kind of making itself very visible out of this broader jet stream here. Very compact jet streak here across Texas. This is at midday or mid-afternoon on Saturday. Very compact, strong jet streak here. So right ahead of that would be your focus for severe storms, East Texas, Louisiana into Mississippi, southern Arkansas, there across this area. But very good looking trough for a severe weather threat there. And that would focus the severe threat in those aforementioned areas. Let's zoom in here and see. Actually, let's keep it out on the zoomed out view. Let's take a look at our warm sector here, our surface pattern development. This is Friday morning. Not much going on. And then we see much more robust surface development with this Saturday system here. Nice tight surface low there across the Red River on this NAM run. So that is going to lead to a more robust low-level response, more stronger warm moist advection off to the north. So even though we'll have this preceding wave today, just 2 days out like we've had with this setup, our Tuesday wave, helping to kind of shunt that moisture to the south and decrease the amount of time for the atmosphere to destabilize, and with that lesser warm moist advection behind that preceding wave. We'll have the same situation here, but we'll have much stronger surface low development, able to kind of compensate for the lack of time for destabilization and warm advection into the region ahead of the Saturday threat. It's very strong surface low, strong surface winds helping to really pull that moisture back to the north after today's setup. Surface low ends up somewhere in the Arklatex region by mid-afternoon on Saturday. Nice tight surface low there, southeast Oklahoma, western Arkansas, with nice southerly flow in the warm sector there. That moves off to the east, northeast pretty quickly toward the Mississippi River, going into the nighttime hours on Saturday. So this looks to be fairly robust here just at first glance, and you see the difference with a stronger surface low, even though that moisture pushed off to the south pretty rapidly there. We'll start to see surface low development there probably Friday night into Saturday morning, helping to rapidly transport that moisture northward over a broader region than what we're seeing with today's setup. So Saturday looks to be a broader, perhaps more robust severe risk. You see our surface low there along the Red River, our frontal zones, cold front down there, warm front over here up into central Arkansas, northern Mississippi, and a broad warm sector to a lot of real estate to support severe weather with the event on Saturday. Perhaps even a little bit of a cold core setup developing here near the surface low and the core of the 500 millibar trough, as that moisture wrapping into that surface low could be a little bit of a cold core threat developing in southern Oklahoma there on Saturday afternoon. But your main severe threat going to be out here within this very broad, robust warm sector. 60s, mid to upper 60s dew points across a broad region here, again providing lots of real estate for a robust severe threat ahead of the system on Saturday. Let's take some soundings here just to look here. We'll take one near the surface low, the Texarkana area, down in the open warm sector, near the cold front, East Texas toward Lufkin, and then perhaps out here in central Louisiana, just to get an idea. This is going to be at mid-afternoon on Saturday. Nice looking instability plume there, 1,200 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. This again is near the Arklatex region. Nice steep lapse rates aloft, much better low levels than what we saw with this event. 0 to 3 kilometer lapse rates, 7 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Much better than what we're seeing with this particular event. Wind profiles are a little bit muted in the low levels, still strong enough low level shear to support a tornado risk. Some curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph. Strong low level instability as well could compensate for the lack of low level shear, helping to stretch vorticity into the vertical to aid in tornadogenesis with these supercells. And nice curvature of the winds there in the low levels, upwards of 200 meters squared per second squared, effective SRH. Down into the East Texas region, a little bit stronger instability, looking pretty good there. And we see kind of the same wind profile, not a ton of curvature, not a ton of turning, a veering of the low-level winds with height, but still strong speed shear in the low levels should allow for some stronger SRH there. Again, upwards of 200 meters squared per second squared. Central Louisiana, much of the same as well in the open warm sector. Here by 0Z, let's take a look at that as well. I want to take a look at the cold core setup perhaps as well. Potential cold core setup in southern Oklahoma, and see what we're seeing there. Probably more stunted CAPE profiles, shallower CAPE profiles, but perhaps more fat CAPE. Classic look for a cold core type event. Not much low-level shear to speak of, but again, very vorticity-driven in these types of events. Not a ton of low-level instability, surprisingly. But we'll have to watch that for sure. Anytime that moisture tongue wraps into the surface low, which is near the 500 millibar cold core low, that starts to ring some bells for a cold core type setup there. Cold front really starts to kind of drag back here with southwest and northeast orientation, perhaps means more of a linear mode there. Again, don't want to get too deep into the details right now this far out from the setup. We'll be back with another video if the setup warrants, but just wanted to give a little bit of an idea what the environment might look like on Saturday afternoon. This is going to be out in the warm sector, north central Louisiana, at 6 p.m., and that is a favorable look for all severe hazards there. Plenty of instability, strong, nice low-level instability as well, upwards of 100 joules per kilogram. 3 Cape with strong low-level shear. So all hazards certainly appear to be on the table for Saturday. Storm mode, again, we'll have to wait and see how that plays out, but Saturday looks to be a fairly potent event across the Gulf Coast states, East Texas, eastward into Louisiana, southern Arkansas, Mississippi, perhaps even Alabama as well. So robust setup, perhaps more robust than what we're dealing with today, given a much broader, richer, warm sector ahead of the surface features there for the Saturday risk. But for now, let's worry about today's setup. Again, we'll be back with additional videos as needed as the Saturday setup approaches. But this is what we have going on for today. Again, you will have a new outlook by the time you see this video, so we'll see if they add an enhanced risk region. I don't believe that's going to happen here with this morning update of the SPC outlook. But for now, what we have is a slight risk, level 2 out of 5, in the yellow shaded region here for today. That includes places like DFW, Waco toward Austin. Again, storms are going to more initiate there, so your severe threat going to be fairly limited in time before things move off to the east and we get the core of that severe threat to take place across East Texas, Houston, Galveston, Beaumont, Orange up to Lufkin, Nacogdoches, Jasper, College Station. You are under the gun there in Texas, Shreveport, Louisiana, Lake Charles, under the gun in Louisiana for that severe threat. Again, all hazards on the table for today. Tornado risk is at a 5%. Depending on storm mode, depending on destabilization, I don't think there is going to be a big, significant tornado risk today, but we could see an outside chance of a strong tornado or two, especially down here to the south, southeast Texas, southwest Louisiana, where destabilization is a little bit stronger, and a supercell mode may be a little bit more favored, at least initially, before things get more clustered and lined out this afternoon into evening. Damaging winds also going to be a threat, as is large hail with any more discrete activity. So certainly a robust setup for today. That threat will persist into the morning tomorrow across Louisiana and Mississippi. Things will wane in intensity with time, but still could see some damaging wind gusts and a brief tornado or two as the line moves off to the east overnight into tomorrow morning. And then on Saturday, our threat is elevated once again at a slight risk for now. Perhaps looks to be more potent than what we are seeing today, with a broader, richer warm sector and an environment favorable for all severe hazards, including tornadoes. But we'll get into Saturday later on. Let's get through today first. If you live in the yellow shaded region today, especially, definitely keep those weather radios handy. Keep those sources of weather, of trustworthy weather information handy, and we'll get through this event just fine. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.